a frail child with fiery red hair, became the immortal musical master of the Four Seasons. The story of Antonio Vivaldi, a genius who defied fate, begins now. Before we delve deeper into the extraordinary life of the Red Priest, we want to ask for your support, which is the lifeblood of this channel. If you are enjoying this journey into history and music, and if you believe, as we do, that these stories deserve to be told, please take a moment to show your appreciation. Click that like button to let us know we're on the right track, and subscribe to join our community of history lovers. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary. And finally, if this story resonates with you, please share it with a friend, a family member, or on your social media. Every like, subscription, and share allows us to continue bringing these incredible biographies to light. Thank you for being here. And now, let's return to the canals of Venice. At the age of 15, a significant and life-altering decision was made for the young Antonio. He formally began his studies to become a priest. In the societal context of 17th century Italy, this was not an uncommon trajectory, and it was certainly not always driven by pure spiritual devotion. For a family of modest means, like the Vivaldis, who possessed a gifted son with a chronic illness, the church offered a powerful and practical solution. It was a pathway to stability, social respect, and most critically, a free, high-quality education in a world where such a thing was a rare privilege. The church was the primary institution for all advanced learning, and entering its service was a virtual guarantee of literacy, intellectual development, and a secure social standing, insulated from the harsh economic realities of the day. This path, however, was bifurcated. There was the parish priest who served a congregation and bore the full weight of pastoral duties, and the mass priest who was fully ordained, but not necessarily attached to a specific church, often serving in a private capacity for a noble family, or as in Vivaldi's case, as a teacher. His journey through the required seminary training was remarkably rapid. He was a quick study, absorbing the theological and liturgical knowledge with ease. In 1703, at the relatively young age of 25, he was fully ordained. It was at this very moment, as he stepped into his new clerical role, that he was branded with the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, becoming his primary identifier across Europe, Il Prete Rosso, or the Red Priest. This was not a subtle or particularly affectionate moniker. It was a blunt, descriptive, and unforgettable label, a direct reference to the vibrant, unmistakable, and in Italy rare red hair he had inherited from his father. In a sea of dark-haired Venetians, Vivaldi, cloaked in the sober robes of his office, would have stood out like a flame, a flash of brilliant color. This striking visual identity became intrinsically, and perhaps fatefully, linked to his musical one, a perfect symbol of the fiery passion, the restless energy, and the unconventional spirit that he would soon bring to the forefront of European music. Despite the solemnity of his ordination and the sacred vows he had taken, Antonio Vivaldi's career as a practicing, mass-celebrating priest was astonishingly, almost comically brief. He was almost immediately, and as many biographers have noted, perhaps quite conveniently, excused from the most rigorous and public-facing duty of his office, the celebration of the Holy Mass, the official reason given, and the one he himself cited consistently throughout his life, was his chronic and debilitating health condition, the stress di petto, this tightness of the chest. The severe asthma that had plagued him since that first frightening day of his life made the physical act of performing the liturgy, which required long periods of standing, controlled, and resonant chanting and moving through the thick cloying clouds of incense, a genuine and recurring ordeal. He claimed in his letters that he often had to abandon the altar midway through a service just to catch his breath, a situation that would have been as embarrassing for him as it was disruptive to the sacred rites. While the severity of his ailment was undoubtedly real and a constant lifelong burden, his letters are filled with complaints about his health. This exemption became the single most important and liberating turning point in his professional life. It was, in effect, a get-out-of-jail-free card from the daily, time-consuming duties that would have otherwise consumed his life and creative energy. The church, by formally acknowledging his profound physical limitations, had inadvertently and ironically unshackled its most promising musical mind. This convenient medical discharge freed Vivaldi not to a life of quiet, pious convalescence, but to dedicate every ounce of his formidable restless energy, every moment of his waking life, to the tempestuous, demanding, and far more glamorous world of professional music. He would retain the title of priest and the don that came with it for his entire life. It afforded him social respect, protection, and access to circles a mere musician could not enter, but his true ministry, his real calling, was not to the God of the Church, but to the God of music. In 1703, the very same year that saw both his ordination and his near immediate exemption from Mass, Vivaldi's new path was definitively forged. He was appointed as the Maestro di Violino, master of the violin, at the Ospedale della Pietà. To modern ears, the word orphanage conjures bleak images of Dickensian hardship, neglect, and gruel. But the Ospedali of Venice were something else entirely. A unique and celebrated feature of the Republic's social fabric. They were, in fact, for prestigious, state-funded institutions, founded to care for the figli di coro, the abandoned, illegitimate, or orphan girls of the city. Over time, these institutions had evolved far beyond simple charity. They had become world-renowned, fiercely competitive conservatories of music. The Pietà was, in essence, one of the most elite and well-funded music schools in all of Europe. The girls, shielded from the public eye, received rigorous, daily musical training from the finest masters the Republic could hire, and the institution's orchestra and all-female choir became a massive cultural attraction, a symbol of Venetian artistic supremacy and civic pride. This was the environment Vivaldi stepped into at age 25. This was not a quiet, contemplative teaching job in a dusty corner. It was the directorship of a high-pressure, high-stakes, and unbelievably well-resourced musical ensemble. He was now responsible not only for the advanced musical education of these gifted young women, but also for composing a steady stream of new music and producing the dazzling sacred concerts that captivated the Venetian nobility and the wealthy international tourists who flocked to the city as part of the Grand Tour. It was a role that perfectly matched his virtuosic skills, his boundless ambition, and his inexhaustible creative energy. Vivaldi's tenure at the Ospedale della Pietà would last, in various official and unofficial capacities, for decades. It was within these hallowed, protected walls that his genius, which had been simmering, truly ignited into a blazing inferno. He composed the vast majority of his instrumental works, a staggering, almost superhuman output of hundreds of concertos, over 500 in his lifetime, sinfonias, and sacred vocal pieces specifically for the talents of the young women under his charge. These were not generic, one-size-fits-all compositions. They were bespoke, meticulously tailor-made pieces designed to showcase the specific, and often prodigious, technical skills of his star pupils. If he had a figlia who showed a particular gift for the flute, he would write a flurry of challenging flute concertos. If one of his violinists mastered a new, complex bowing technique or a dizzying passage in the high register, he would immediately write a new piece to push her and the instrument's technique even further. He trained them with a relentless, demanding, and inspiring passion, transforming the Pietà's orchestra into a world-famous, almost mythical ensemble. Dignitaries, royalty, music lovers, and cultural critics from all over Europe, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, flocked to Venice, and a primary, unmissable stop on their itinerary was the Pietà's church. There, they would listen in absolute, rapturous awe, in a curious social custom of the time designed to protect the girls' modesty and add to their mystique. The figli di coro performed from a high gallery completely hidden from the audience's view by a heavy ornate grille or screen. This auditory-only experience, as Rousseau later wrote, only heightened the effect. The angelic music performed with a precision and passion that rivaled any professional orchestra in Europe, seemed to float down from heaven itself, created by unseen, almost divine beings. This position at the Pietà was far more than a job. It was the ultimate creative forge, a musical laboratory that no other composer in the world could dream of possessing. Vivaldi, as the Maestro di Concerti, director of instrumental music, was given an incredible, almost unfettered, sandbox in which to experiment with musical forms, orchestral instrumentation, and harmonic structure. This arrangement provided a unique, real-time feedback loop that was, for its time, revolutionary. He could conceive of a complex, technically demanding, and utterly experimental violin concerto. In the morning hand the freshly inked parts to his highly skilled, disciplined, and dedicated orchestra of Figli, and hear it performed flawlessly in its entirety that very same evening. This real-time iteration, this ability to compose, test, and refine, was a priceless gift. While other composers might wait months or even years to hear their new works performed, often by under-rehearsed and indifferent musicians, Vivaldi had instant validation and the immediate ability to adjust a dynamic fix, a harmony, or push a virtuosic passage even further. This unique workshop environment allowed him to single-handedly perfect and popularize the form of the solo concerto, standardizing its three-movement fast-slow-fast structure that persists to this day. He championed and developed the ritornello form, where a recurring, robust orchestral theme, the ritornello, alternates and contrasts with the freewheeling, virtuosic, and emotionally expressive passages from the soloist. He relentlessly pushed the boundaries of violin technique, demanding new levels of dexterity, speed, and emotional expression that he himself, as a master virtuoso, had perfected. In 1725, at the absolute zenith of his international fame and creative powers, Vivaldi published his most celebrated and artistically ambitious set of concertos, his Opus 8. He gave it the bold, philosophical title Il cemento dell'armonia e dell'invenzione, the contest between harmony and invention. This title was not mere packaging, it was a bold manifesto, a public declaration of his core artistic philosophy. He was staging a duel between harmony, armonia, representing the established rules, the rigid traditions, the expected forms, and the intellectual craft of music, and invention, invenzione, representing the wild, untamed creative impulse, the spark of genius, and the emotional descriptive power of music. Vivaldi was, in effect, showing the entire world how he could meticulously master all the rules of composition, only to spectacularly and beautifully break them. The first four concertos in this collection of 12 were set apart from the rest. They were given individual, evocative titles: La Primavera, Spring; L'estate, Summer; L'Autunno, Autumn; and L'Inverno, Winter. Collectively, they were presented to the world as Le Quattro Stagioni, the four seasons. This was not just a clever marketing gimmick, it was a profound artistic revolution, a masterstroke of musical storytelling that would change the course of music history forever. What made the Four Seasons so utterly revolutionary was that it stands as one of the earliest, most detailed, most specific, and most artistically brilliant examples of program music. This is instrumental music, music without words that tells a specific story, paints a precise picture, or evokes a non-musical idea. Until this point, most music in the Baroque era was absolute music, existing as abstract, beautiful patterns of sound, a fugue, a sonata that was not about anything other than its own structure. Vivaldi shattered this convention with unprecedented force. He didn't just write music to suggest a spring-like or wintry mood. He used the instruments of the orchestra to sonically paint vivid, specific, and sequential scenes from life, to ensure that absolutely no one, from the amateur musician to the sophisticated connoisseur, missed the point. He published the concertos with a set of 4 accompanying sonnets, which were quite possibly, and even probably, written by Vivaldi himself. He then went a step further, meticulously marking in the musical score the exact line of poetry, and even the specific word, that the music was illustrating at that very moment. Thus in spring you don't just hear a happy, cheerful melody. You hear the joyous, specific songs of birds represented by a trio of trilling solo violins, the gentle murmur of a stream played by the violas, and a sudden brief thunderstorm, a dramatic flashing passage from the full orchestra that passes as quickly as it came. In summer, the music becomes oppressive, the air heavy and stagnant, before exploding into a violent, terrifying hailstorm of breathtaking fury represented by shockingly dramatic, fast scales from the solo violin. In winter, you are not just cold, you can literally hear the chattering of teeth, dissonant, percussive, repeated notes from the soloist, and then feel the sublime, profound solace of sitting by a warm, crackling fire a beautiful, slow-spun melody from the solo violin, while the icy rain beats relentlessly outside represented by pizzicato, or plucked, strings from the orchestra. This was vivid, cinematic storytelling of a kind never before attempted with this level of precision, imagination, and artistic success. Beyond the cloistered, sacred walls of the Pietà, Vivaldi was a force of nature, a true international rock star virtuoso, and a prolific, hard-nosed, and relentlessly ambitious opera impresario. His technical skill on the violin was the stuff of pure legend, a skill he had honed since childhood under his father's tutelage. Contemporaries, including trained musicians, wrote in stunned, almost bewildered, disbelief of his public performances. They describe how he could play with an impossible, demonic speed and a fiery passion that left audiences breathless. One German witness wrote that Vivaldi could reach notes so astonishingly high on the fingerboard that there was scarcely room for the bow to pass, a feat of acrobatics that was, at the time, simply unheard of. But his ambition was far too vast to be contained by the concerto form alone. He threw himself headlong into the glamorous, cutthroat, and financially perilous world of public opera, which was the most popular and potentially lucrative entertainment of the day. He composed and staged over 50 operas. Sadly, only about 20 survive in complete form. Managing every single aspect of the production, he was not just the composer, he was the impresario, the producer, the conductor, and the talent scout, hiring the superstar divas and castrati, battling with the often absurd demands of the librettists, and fighting with the state censors over perceived immoral content. This whirlwind of relentless activity, combined with his publications, spread his fame like wildfire across the European continent. His published music was a commercial bestseller, eagerly snapped up by musicians, amateurs, and aristocrats from Dublin to Dresden. His influence was profound and far-reaching, most notably on the great German master, Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach was so deeply impressed by Vivaldi's structural clarity, his innovative harmonic sequences, and his vibrant rhythmic drive that he meticulously studied and transcribed several of Vivaldi's violin concertos from L'Astro Armonico for the organ and harpsichord. This was not plagiarism. It was an act of pure scholarly devotion and study, an act that, ironically, would later play a crucial and pivotal role in Vivaldi's own survival and resurrection from obscurity. Despite the dizzying heights of his international fame and his reputation as Europe's preeminent instrumental composer, the musical tides in Venice, his own home city, began to turn against him in the 1730s. Tastes, especially in a city as fashion-conscious as Venice, are notoriously fickle. The very style Vivaldi had championed, the energetic, complex, emotionally dense, and richly ornamented high baroque, was beginning to sound old-fashioned and ponderous to the new generation. A new, simpler, more gallant style was capturing the public's ear, a style characterized by lighter textures, simpler harmonies, and elegant, hummable melodies. Audiences, who were once enraptured by his daring harmonies and virtuosic violin pyrotechnics, now grew restless and sought out the novelties of younger composers. His operas, once guaranteed crowd pleasers, began to fail, one after another. At the box office, this dramatic shift in public favor had swift and devastating financial consequences. Vivaldi, for all his musical genius, was a notoriously profligate spender and, by all accounts, a rather poor financial manager. He lived the life of a superstar, pouring vast sums of his own money into his lavish opera productions. As his music fell out of favor, his primary source of income, the opera houses, and new commissions, dried up almost completely, leaving him in an increasingly precarious, and for a man of his stature, humiliating, financial position. The Red Priest, who had once been the toast of Europe, found himself struggling to stay afloat, his star fading in the very city he had helped make famous. Facing the cold realities of artistic irrelevance and impending financial ruin in his beloved Venice, Vivaldi, now in his early 60s and in declining health, made a final, desperate gamble. He decided to leave his home city and seek a prestigious new patron who could guarantee him a stable income and a dignified old age, allowing him to compose without the grubby anxieties of the box office. His chosen destination was Vienna, and his target was the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI. This was not a blind, naive hope. It was a calculated move. The emperor was a genuine and passionate admirer of Vivaldi's work, a true connoisseur. He had previously met the composer in Trieste and, according to contemporary reports, had honored Vivaldi with more conversation, praise, and valuable gifts in a single meeting than he bestowed on his own ministers in a year. Charles VI had even reportedly declared Vivaldi's music to be his favorite. And so, in 1740, Vivaldi packed up his most valuable manuscripts and set off on the arduous journey over the Alps to the Austrian capital, banking his entire future on securing a coveted position as a court composer. However, in a cruel, devastating twist of fate that sealed his doom, Emperor Charles VI died suddenly in October 1740, just a short time after Vivaldi's arrival in Vienna. The one man in the world who held the key to his salvation, his most powerful and wealthy admirer, was suddenly gone. Vivaldi was left stranded, penniless, unknown, and without prospects in a foreign city that was now plunged into a period of mourning and political uncertainty. On July 28, 1741, less than a year after his hopeful rival in Vienna, Antonio Vivaldi died. He was 63 years old, the Red Priest whose music had once electrified a continent, whose innovations had reshaped the very sound of the orchestra, and whose name was spoken with reverence in the courts of kings and palaces of cardinals, died in abject poverty. He perished in a rented room in a building owned by a Viennese saddler, a building near the Kärntnertor, the site of the future Vienna State Opera. The city he died in was in turmoil, mourning its late emperor and consumed by the political instability and power struggles that would soon erupt into the decade-long war of the Austrian succession. In this atmosphere of crisis, no one had the time, the money, or the inclination to concern themselves with a forgotten, elderly Italian composer. Antonio Vivaldi was given the simplest, cheapest possible burial, a pauper's burial, recorded in the cathedral's register as costing a mere 19 florins. His body was interred in a common, unmarked grave at the Ospedale della Pietà, a hospital cemetery designated for the indigent. The exact location of his grave was never marked and has since been lost forever. Built over in the 19th century by the sprawling campus of the Technical University of Vienna, his death went virtually unnoticed. There were no obituaries in the Viennese papers, no eulogies in Venice. His name and his vast, brilliant catalogue of music was almost entirely and immediately forgotten, vanishing as if it had never been. For nearly 200 years, an almost unimaginable span of time, Antonio Vivaldi was a mere footnote in the annals of music history. He was not just unpopular or overlooked. He was, for all intents and purposes, erased from the cultural memory of Europe. Music dictionaries and histories of the 18th and 19th centuries, if they bothered to mention him at all, dismissed him as a minor, eccentric composer of curious, if overly simplistic, violin pieces. His true, monumental legacy was kept alive, ironically and tenuously, not by his own works, but because the great and revered Johann Sebastian Bach had, decades earlier, bothered to transcribe a handful of his concertos. For generations of music students and scholars, Vivaldi was known primarily, and often solely, as a composer Bach admired, a tiny, insignificant twig on a branch of a much larger and more important tree. His hundreds of other concertos, his groundbreaking operas, his deeply moving sacred music, all of it gathered dust, unplayed, unpublished, and unknown, hidden away in forgotten archives and aristocratic libraries. His profound innovations in the concerto form, his pioneering use of programmatic music, his development of orchestral color, and violin technique, all of these achievements were either misattributed to other composers of the era or simply overlooked entirely as the world moved on. The true revival, the dramatic resurrection of Vivaldi's genius from the grave of history, began not in a concert hall but in a dusty, overlooked library, and it unfolded with all the suspense and unlikely coincidences of a detective novel. In the 1920s, the administrators of a Salesian monastery in Piedmont, Italy, found themselves in need of funds to repair their school. Rummaging through their archives, they discovered a large collection of old music manuscripts, which they decided to sell. They contacted the National Library in Turin, hoping the collection might be worth a small sum. Dr. Alberto Gentili, a respected musicologist at the University of Turin, was dispatched to examine the volumes. What he found made his heart stop: a massive, previously unknown, and priceless collection of Vivaldi's personal manuscripts, containing hundreds of works, operas, concertos, and sacred pieces that the world had long presumed lost forever. But the mystery only deepened. The collection was clearly incomplete, with volumes missing. With painstaking detective work, Gentili eventually traced the second, even larger, cache of manuscripts to the archives of a wealthy Genoese family. They were the descendants of a Venetian collector who had, centuries earlier, acquired the other half of Vivaldi's estate. After complex, secret, and delicate negotiations involving a wealthy benefactor who purchased and then donated the works to the library, the two halves of the collection were finally reunited in Turin in the 1930s. As scholars began to pore over this treasure trove, the true, staggering, and undeniable scope of Antonio Vivaldi's genius was revealed for the first time into centuries. The incredible discovery of the Turin manuscripts in the 1920s and 30s was the spark, but the full resurrection and popular explosion of Vivaldi's music took place in the years following World War II. It took a new generation of passionate and dedicated musicians, scholars, and conductors to pore over these newly found works, meticulously edit them, from Vivaldi's spidery handwriting into modern playable scores, and most importantly perform them for a new audience. The advent of a new technology, the long-playing LP record, was a crucial catalyst. Vivaldi's music, with its clear structures, its infectious rhythmic vitality, its brilliant solo passages, and its direct emotional appeal, was perfectly suited to this new medium of mass consumption. Ensembles like the Italian chamber group One Musici championed his work, and their 1955 recording of the Four Seasons became an unexpected global phenomenon. It was one of the very first classical blockbusters, selling millions of copies and introducing audiences around the world to this new and exciting 100-year-old composer. The Four Seasons, in particular, captured the public's imagination, its vivid storytelling and raw emotional immediacy resonating as powerfully in the turbulent 20th century as it had in the 18th. Today, Antonio Vivaldi's place in the pantheon of great composers is secure and unassailable. The Four Seasons has become one of the most beloved, instantly recognizable, and universally performed pieces of classical music in all of history. Its melodies are woven into the very fabric of our global culture, appearing in countless films, advertisements, and even as ubiquitous telephone hold music a form of cultural omnipresence that speaks to its profound and enduring appeal. The sickly boy from Venice, the priest who could not say mass, the opera impresario who went bankrupt, and the forgotten genius who died a pauper, that man Prete Rosso ultimately achieved the immortality he so desperately sought in Vienna. He found it not through the fleeting patronage of a mortal emperor, but through the sheer, undeniable, and eternal power of his own invention. He taught the world how to listen, how to hear the birds sing, the storms rage, and the ice crackle, ensuring that the priest who painted the seasons with his violin would live on forever.